Let's go. John 6:44. This one's going to be big. Episode 1, we covered John 17:9, where Jesus says, I pray for my disciples, I do not pray for the world. And we asked one question. Our question was, what specifically did he pray for? And when you answer that question with John 17, Calvinism leaves the whole chapter. Then episode 2, we did John chapter 10, verses 26 through 30, specifically where he says, you don't believe because you're not my sheep. And we asked one question there as well. The question was, what specifically didn't they believe? And when you answer that question, Calvinism leaves. I got one question for this one as well. John 6:44 is, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day. My question here, not as obvious as the other ones, my question here is this: why is that statement placed in the middle of John chapter 6? If you answer that with chapter 6, Calvinism leaves the whole chapter, the entire thing. We're going to go through several verses here, not just 6:44, but we're going to go through almost everything they use in chapter 6 to validate Calvinism. It's exactly the opposite. First, we got to go through and recover the story from John 1 all the way to John 6 so you understand where they're at now. Lord of the Rings, the second book, The Two Towers, there's a moment where Sam and Frodo were talking, and Sam says, I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into, Mr. Frodo. Remember, because they're from the Shire, right? They're from the peaceful place, the safe place. They grew up in the fields and all that, and they're not aware of the adventure that's already happening, and they're going to find themselves in the middle of it. They don't know about the danger out there and the evil forces and all the powers that be. And when they figure it out, all of a sudden everything gets real, and they see how close they are to danger and how dire the situation is that they're in right now. And the story's already going on without them. They don't show up at the beginning. They show up in the middle, and they find themselves in the middle of it. That's John chapter 6. When you see these people that he's talking to at Capernaum, who followed it in Capernaum, they become aware of where they are in the story, and they panic. And you need to understand what's happening there before you can read 6:44, because the reason they turn away from Jesus, it changes everything. Follow me here. Through John, Jesus, up until this point, Jesus does several miracles. It's pretty amazing. Let's go through the whole thing. John chapter 1, the Word becomes flesh. The Word gets validated by John the Baptist. The Word gets baptized, and John the Baptist preaches the Word to everyone. And then he goes out and he finds his 12 disciples, gathers his disciples together, and they start following him. And then he goes to a wedding feast, the wedding festival, and he makes like 300 gallons of wine. Awesome. Okay, party. And he heals a guy's sick kid from a distance. The guy comes from Cana, says, my son is sick. And Jesus says, your son will live. And that hour, the fever left him. Praise God. I'm forever grateful. My son is alive. And then he goes and heals the guy at the pool of Bethesda who can't walk. He's paralyzed. And Jesus gives him back his legs. And how amazing is that, right? That's awesome. And then he goes and he clears out the temple as well. That's part of, we'll talk about that another time. And then he feeds 5,000 people with like a meal that was meant for like a person and a half. It's jackpot. We get to eat today. And then he walks on water. And all this happens in the Gospel of John so far. And then the next day, after those two things happen, he feeds 5,000 people, he walks on water that night, and then the next day, the people he fed come and find him. They go around the lake, and they go find him where he's at in Capernaum. And those are the same people he's talking to from yesterday, the same people he's talking to today. Let's go back really quick and look at the conversations Jesus has now, because the personality that John is showing of Jesus matters a lot in this argument in John chapter 6 against Calvinism, okay? He talks to Nathaniel first. He says, hey, I saw you under a tree. And Nathaniel realizes he's got, omniscience? Yes, omniscience is the one where you know everything. And he's amazing. He's a believer, right? Then he goes on. He talks with Mary in chapter 2. That's fine. She's covered. And then in chapter 3, he talks with Nicodemus for 21 verses. That's how much narrative Nicodemus gets. And we read chapter 3. John 3, where about being born of water and the Spirit, and about how for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. And we read all that today as if it was written to us, like 2,000 years removed. Don't forget, Jesus had this conversation in real time just between him and one guy. It was him and Nicodemus. I'm not saying it's just for him, it's for everybody. But just put yourself in that position that he sat there and gave Nicodemus his time and explained a concept to him, just answered his questions. It's very personal. That personal touch is huge. And I just imagine, what would that be like if Jesus just sat down with you for an evening and just hung out and talked with you? I mean, that would be spectacular. And we know from the end of chapter 7 and the end of chapter 19 that Nicodemus, at least he favors Jesus. When he's talking with the Pharisees, he says, look, we cannot condemn this guy until he's had a just trial and given his testimony. And then in chapter 19, when he takes the body down with Joseph of Arimathea and buries the body properly, that's essentially like a slap in the face to the Jews who just put him to death. So Nicodemus is on Jesus' side. Then John chapter 4, he's talking with the woman at the well, and Nicodemus got 21 verses. She gets like 40. Because remember, she leaves and then she comes back with people that same day. That's all her section. I think it's like 42 or 43 verses that's dedicated to her section of the story. And again, it's just her and him talking at the well, just the two of them. And it's fascinating to see that Jesus invests his time into an individual like that. And then in chapter 5, he gets in a fight with the Jews. And for like 30 verses in here, it's quite fascinating. It's like the greatest "I don't work for you" statement in the Gospel of John, where he shuts them down. They're trying to come up and kill him, which you won't really catch that if you listen to audio Bibles, because they don't do justice to the attitude going on at the time, the tempo of the story. But these people just tried to kill him, and then Jesus is sitting there and he gives, I think John records 30 or 31 verses as his response to them. And he basically tells them in so many words, I'll summarize here really quick. He says, I don't work for you, essentially. He says, I get my authority from the Father. I get my power from the Father. Whatever the Father does, that's what I do. I get my identity from the Father. The Father makes me the judge of everything here. John the Baptist validates me. My miracles validate me. The Father validates me. And your scriptures even validate me. And so he basically just tells them, sit down, right? It's strong. And now we're at chapter 6. And he feeds 5,000 people. And then they come and they find him the next day. And I want to clear the air with this one here first as well. They get a bad rap oftentimes for being the people who just wanted to eat more food, because that's how Jesus starts the conversation. But don't make this mistake, okay? When they show up in Capernaum, they come and follow him. They follow around across the lake, and they find him there in Capernaum. Jesus starts the conversation there on purpose, because that's the common ground they already have. They shared a meal yesterday that Jesus made, right? They're human. Humans get hungry. That's not a crime. But Jesus wants the conversation to go a certain direction. So he's the one who says, you guys aren't here for any signs and wonders. You're here because you're hungry, aren't you? And they sort of go along with it because they probably are hungry. Like consider this. Yesterday, you witnessed Jesus summoning food out of thin air. And it wasn't like hard for him. You're telling me you wouldn't ask him for a sandwich again the next day if you found him again? Like, we all would. Of course we would. And these are the same people. This is important. These are the same people who recognize Jesus as the prophet that Moses promised, or that God promised through Moses in Deuteronomy 18, from verse 15 to verse 18. There's 4 verses there in Deuteronomy chapter 18 where there's like a specific prophet that Moses said is going to come. And they peg him and they say, you're the one. And they were right, by the way. But of course, he's more than that, which he tells them in this conversation. But they affirmed that as well. They didn't just say, oh, he's claiming to be a prophet and then dismiss him. They agreed that he was the prophet. And they wanted to take him that day and make him their king. Those are the same people. So don't just think they only came back for food. That's a big mistake. Okay, Jesus, what he's doing is bringing the conversation back to this common ground they shared from yesterday, the meal they had. Just like he did with Nicodemus talking about birth. Just like he did with the woman at the well talking about water. Jesus enters the conversation at their mutual point of commonality here, where the meal they had, and he says, you guys are hungry again, aren't you? Because he wants to start from that subject and he wants to pivot into the subject he really wants to talk about, which is where they get off track. And they get cold feet, and when they realize what he's saying, they panic. So what he says, I'll skip some of the parts and we'll come back through and fill in the gaps as we go. He says, look, don't go after food. You're just going to be hungry again. Go after food that you eat it and you're never hungry again. There's certain food you can eat and you're never hungry again. In fact, I know of that food. Right? That food came down from heaven, and I can give you that food. And that food, in fact, it turns into eternal life for you. In fact, I know where that food comes from because I came down from heaven. And they all of a sudden they get nervous and they take a step back like they're losing their confidence. What just happened here? What happened in the story? You got to recognize what's going on now, because they're going to realize where they are in this tale. Just like Sam and Frodo, where Sam says, I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into. They are becoming very much aware of the danger in front of them, and they figure out where in the story they stand now. The sticking point specifically is that he said that he came down from heaven. According to the Jews, nobody's in heaven yet. Remember, the Sadducees think when you die, you're dead. But the Pharisees and the common Jewish folk, they believe there's an afterlife, but they think there's a resurrection first. Look at chapter 11 with Mary and Martha. They say, because they don't know Lazarus is coming back in a few minutes, they say, I know I'll see my brother again. When? When I die and go to heaven? No, in the resurrection at the last day. Look at Acts chapter 2 when Peter's speaking to the 3,000 Jews. He said, he looks at David, like the prophet David. He says, we've got his ossuary or his grave here. We've got his grave. We have his bones. And he says, David, like anointed David, he hasn't even ascended to heaven yet. But this Jesus I'm telling you about, he ascended to heaven first and then David followed later. So no one's in heaven yet. But Jesus just says he was from heaven first. He existed in heaven first and he came to earth. And they recognize he's not an angel because they already pinned him as a prophet. So the only other option is he's God. He's claiming to be God, which, by the way, that's why they wanted to kill him the whole time. In John chapter 5, they said that you claim to be the Son of God, therefore you're making yourself equal with God. That's why we're going to kill you. In John chapter 8, he says, you guys, if you were really sons of Abraham, you wouldn't be trying to kill me right now, because Abraham didn't try to kill me, but you are. In chapter 10, he says, he asks them, which good work? I did lots of good works. Which one are you stoning me for? And they said, not for a good work. We're stoning you for blasphemy because you're a man. You're making yourself out to be God. Go back to chapter 7. There's a feast in chapter 7, and it says people wouldn't even talk about Jesus because they were afraid of the Jews. This is huge. The people who followed him to Capernaum here in chapter 6, they just got roped into this deal. It's not just about having eternal life. It's about, they recognize the identity that Jesus is claiming, and they realize he wants them to trust him with their life. And if word gets out, they believe this thing that he's talking about, they're stuck. They're toast. Because, follow me here, they already affirmed him as the prophet from Deuteronomy chapter 18. So they knew about Deuteronomy chapter 18. You think that means they knew about Deuteronomy 13? Oh yeah, they certainly do. What's in 13? It's one subject matter in chapter 13, and it's written 3 times. It says, if anyone among you, I'll summarize again, go read it. It's 18 verses, I think, in Deuteronomy chapter 13. If anyone among you, whether it's someone claiming to be a prophet, whether it's a friend, a family member, doesn't matter. Anyone among you comes up trying to get you to follow and worship and serve any other gods, and he teaches and preaches and proclaims any other gods besides the one God Israel's familiar with, kill him. That's written 3 times. That's under the Old Covenant in the Old Testament Israel. And Capernaum was northern Israel still. They're under the Jewish law, just like the rest of Israel is. We're in the New Covenant. We don't deal with that stuff today. But that back then, in the society they had, which was a theocracy, where the religious elite, essentially they are the authority, they are the government. That's what they were commanded to do. This is why the Jews are not shy about the fact they want to kill Jesus. You ever asked that question? Like, how come no one went to the Sanhedrin and said, hey, these guys are trying to kill me, put a stop to it? That never happened because they're convinced they're allowed to, and they're convinced they're commanded to kill him. Now later the Jews are quiet when they want to go at nighttime and take him under the cover of darkness and force him into an unlawful trial. They're quiet about that. But they're wide open about the fact they want to kill Jesus, and they're trying to kill Jesus. That's just plain obvious. We'll talk about Paul in the next few episodes here, how his conversion disproves total depravity. But this is how Paul's statements all make sense as well. Paul says 3 things. He says, I was killing Christians, but I was also blameless under the law, and I received grace because I did this in ignorance. This is how that makes sense, because everyone's convinced Jesus is identifying himself as God, and they're convinced he's wrong, therefore under the law they have the authority to kill him. Go read Acts chapter 7. Stephen gives this massive preaching session toward the Jews about Jesus, and they hate him for it. They're just sick of it, and they want to throw him out of the city. They don't, go read the end of chapter 7, the end of it. They do not go to stone him until he says first, I see the heavens open, and the Son is on that same throne with the Father. When they hear that, they said, that's it, put him to death. Because they recognize there's one throne and the only person on that is God. And he says, and Jesus is standing on the throne at the time, but he says Jesus is on that throne next to the Father. And when he says that, that's when they put him to death. So that's what the people who followed into Capernaum just figured out where they are in the story. And everything changed, and they panic because they don't want, I don't know what their issue is. Maybe they have families and they're nervous. They don't trust Jesus enough to have him preserve their life. He already mentioned to them, by the way, this is interesting. He already mentioned to them that it's the Father's will that everyone who comes to me, none of them are going to perish. Which he says that it's the Father's will that I don't lose any. Which immediate context, he's talking about their life. Go read John chapter 17. And this is why he brings this up, by the way, because he knew they were going to be nervous about hearing that he's God. But in John chapter 17, when he's praying to the Father, which we did in episode 1, he says, it's a past tense statement. He says, I have kept them, and none of them is lost, except the son of perdition, Judas, because within 24 hours, he's going to go hang himself. But the rest of them are still alive. They're still preserved. In chapter 18, then the very next chapter is confirmed. That's what he's talking about. That angry mob comes to grab him, and he says, take me. I'll go with you. Take me. Leave them alone, so that the saying would be fulfilled, I didn't lose any. The saying from chapter 6 gets validated and fulfilled in chapter 18 when he preserves their life and says, take me and let them go. Because it's in immediate context, it's about their life. And he knew that was going to be a hang-up point for the people in chapter 6. That's why he already told them that to begin with. He mentioned that. And they hear the identity that he's talking about, that he came from heaven, and now they get nervous because they realize their life is at stake. It's much more than just recognizing him as a prophet. Because that's the difference, by the way, is that they were happy to have him as a prophet, and they were happy to make him their king. And then the very next day, he says, I'm a lot more than just a prophet, guys. I'm God. And that's when they pull away from him. They recognize what sort of tale they've been dropped into here. And now you're ready for 644. This whole time we had to prep the story so that you can hear 644, what's really going on here. He tells them this statement, those information about how he came down from heaven, and through him is eternal life. And they get nervous and they start backing away. And the term is murmuring. They're murmuring amongst themselves, like they're talking amongst themselves, right? And he says that don't talk amongst yourselves, guys. You need to know something here. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day. Well, let me try it again. Okay. They're nervous. They're backing away now. They're losing confidence. He doesn't want them to. They're on good terms here. This isn't like the last chapter where the people are at odds with him. This is like a friendship going on here. They come with in a gesture of good faith. He doesn't want them to leave. And he says, no one can come to me. It's no accident that he says this after they get nervous and they start to panic. And he says, don't talk amongst yourselves about this, guys. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. As opposed to what? Let's put it this way. Let me put it this way, and this will make sense, okay? He says, the Pharisees don't draw anybody to me. The rabbis don't draw anybody to me. Any false prophets out there, they don't draw anybody to me. The pagans don't draw anyone to me. No one comes to me from any of those sources. That Satan and demons and evil spirits, nobody comes to me from there. All of them hate me. But the only reason you're standing here right now is because the Father is the one who drew you to me. And I want you to recognize where you are in this path and stay the course to see this through and put your faith in me. That's how 644 makes sense. It's not about establishing total depravity. It's about establishing a singular accessibility. Jesus is letting them know where they already are in the story. They've already come to him. They're at him now. That you're reading it. You're reading the story where they came to Jesus. That's what happens. And he doesn't want them to leave. So when he sees them get nervous and start to lose confidence and pull back away from him, he tells them how they got there in the first place. That's 644. Does that make sense? And then he goes into the teaching deeper. He says, look, I'm a lot older than you guys think. I was with your ancestors in the desert. I was the one who sustained them and provided for them. He literally says, I am that bread that came down from heaven. That's me. And if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, if you consume me, you'll have eternal life. And they get nervous again and they start backing away. And now the Calvinist is going to think, toward the end of chapter 6, 665, I believe is where it's at, where they think Jesus is actually shooing them away. He's wishing them farewell when they start to turn, because he says these words. He says, but some of you don't believe. He established that first, and then John fills in the same thing as a narrative. John says, because Jesus knew who it was that wouldn't believe. And that's why Jesus reminds them again. He says, this is why I told you guys, no one could come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them. He's telling them, I know you don't believe right now, and that's why I'm letting you know the Father's the reason you're here to begin with. Look, let me tell you this way. If he wanted to talk about total depravity, if he wanted to establish total depravity and limited atonement, this would have been in chapter 5. That was my question at the very beginning of this video. I said, why is this statement in chapter 6? Let me run that for you. He's at odds with these Jews in chapter 5 who just tried to kill him, and they're still seeking to kill him. And he says, wait, time out, stop. I don't answer to you. I get my authority from the Father. I get my identity from the Father. I get my validation from the Father. And by the way, he's only going to draw certain people to me. He's not going to draw everybody. And the reason you don't believe in me is because you're not one of them. That would have proved Calvinism like fireworks. But it's not in chapter 5. This statement is in chapter 6. And everything is different. The setting is different. The audience is different. Their attitude is different. That's all different. And he says this in chapter 6 when they get nervous and they're about ready to turn and leave. I mean, he already said this earlier. He already said, all that the Father brings to me will come to me, and anyone who comes to me, I won't cast them out. But now when they're leaving, they're turning to leave, he says, look, some of you guys don't believe. And then he said, this is why I told you, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them. The Calvinists think he's just shooing them away. The Calvinists think he is casting them out. As if Jesus is saying, hey guys, come here. Hey, you real disciples over here? Come here, let me show you this. See them? See how they're walking away? This is why I told you guys, the Father's only drawing some people, he's not drawing others. That's exactly the opposite of what Jesus is doing here. He already said, I don't cast them out. And then when they get nervous, he says, some of you don't believe, and this is why I told you, no one can even come to me unless the Father drew him here. Trying to build up their confidence and let them know this is not a mistake. You're not here by accident. You're here, and this is the work of God. This is the work of God, that you believe in him who he sent. And that's why also he says at the end of this whole conversation, he looks into the disciples and left and says, are you guys going to leave too? They say, no, we have nowhere to go. You've got the words of eternal life. And then he fills in the gap. He puts this statement in there. He says, didn't I choose you 12? He says, I don't cast anyone out, right? He said, I chose the 12 of you guys, right? And one of you is a devil. What's he saying? He's saying, I don't cast anybody out. Otherwise, I would have started with Judas. But I cast nobody out. And Calvinism gets this exactly backwards. They think in 665 that he's saying goodbye. He's saying, bye guys, see ya. Hey, it is what it is, right? 100% wrong. It's exactly the opposite. He wants them to stay. And he's trying to build up their confidence so that they stay and they get nervous and they leave. That's how 644 makes sense, and 637 makes sense, and 665 makes sense. Because Jesus is giving them his identity. And he wants them to trust in him with everything, including with their life. And they're not willing to do it for whatever reason. That's how this makes sense. If you look at 644 specifically, the word for drawing is the word helko. I think it's translated helkise, if I'm speaking Greek properly. If they wanted to say that that the Father draws people irresistibly, he just makes a decision and that's how it happens, they would have used, at least they could have used the word anteleo, and that conveys the point far greater than helko. Anteleo is used for drawing 3 times in chapter 4 with the woman at the well, drawing water up in a bucket from the well. The water doesn't comply with anything. There's no offer made to the water. There's no agreement made, nothing. The water sits there and everything rests in the hands of the guy at the end of the rope. That's the word anteleo for drawing. But they don't use that. They use the word helko for drawing in 644. You know where else you see this word? I know it's in 1232, and we all know that verse. All the people who aren't Calvinists, that works for us, that's fine. Where it says, when Jesus is lifted up, he will draw everyone to himself. We accept that. The Calvinists will just brush that off. That's not going to work for them. They're going to throw that out and say that all doesn't mean every individual person. It means a complete group. I'm not talking about 1232. This word helko for drawing shows up somewhere else that's very significant. In Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 4, in the Greek Septuagint, the Old Testament Greek, describing a king drawing to him his lover. Ooh. See, the Father doesn't ravage anybody. He romances people. And that's why, if you really want to, you can resist his advances on you. In Hosea chapter 11, it says he drew certain people to him, and they rebelled. They resisted anyway. And the Calvinist has no answer for this except for to throw that out as well. They say, well, it's obviously a different type of drawing, even though there's no evidence of that whatsoever, except for the fact that they have to say that, otherwise it doesn't validate the Calvinism. I drew them with cords, but they rebelled anyway. I'll put the verses up here. That's in Hosea chapter 11. Or it might have been chapter 10. I'm doing all of this by memory right now. I'll put it up here. It's whatever is on the screen that's accurate, okay? But get this, in Song of Solomon, chapter 1, they're going to hate me. They're going to hate me so much. Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 4. You know who says that statement about drawing, the word helico? It's the woman involved. Follow me here. She says to the king, she petitions him, draw me to you. There's a term for that. You know what the term is? Synergy. I told you they're going to hate me. Oh, this is like a bad word. Like, how dare you say yes to Jesus? Like, oh, whatever, dude. Get over yourself. Like, I didn't make him give everybody a choice. He chose to give everybody a choice. He wants a relationship to be reciprocal. That's how a relationship has a value. This makes perfect sense if you get over your Calvinism. But anyway, if this isn't correct, and he did want them to go away because they weren't chosen, and he doesn't care about people who leave because everyone who is elect, in the Calvinist elect, means you're chosen to get saved, which is wrong. But let's just go with that for now, for a second. If that's what's happening, and everyone who's elect is automatically, necessarily, immutably, irresistibly going to come to Jesus, why is he crying in Matthew 23:37 and Luke 19:41 over Jews who were lost, over people who were lost? Just forget it. You guys were never going to be saved anyway. In fact, I didn't die for you. Limited atonement, right? Now that'll be one of our. We got to cover a lot of ground here. I'm going to cut this video short at 27 minutes. We're going to cover Judas, show that he was part of the chosen group, and he was part of those that Jesus had and died for and everything. We'll cover Paul's conversion, and we'll also cover Matthew 23:37, Luke 19:41, and we'll do all of that, and then we'll see how this goes the next week or two, and we'll come back and fill in some gaps here with John chapter 6. I'm sure we'll get lots of flack from Calvinists coming up saying you're mishandling the text and all that. Like, I know James White says this. James White says we drive a wedge in the middle of 644 where we make a separate category of people from people who get drawn and then all of a sudden they get raised up. He says we make a new category. He makes a sound effect. He goes, we put a wedge in the middle of 644, and there's an extra group of people we add that get drawn and don't get raised up. We don't do that. John did that already. That's literally the story. You see why they want to take verses out and read individual verses by themselves and say, oh, I'm going to base my doctrine on this one verse. You don't get to do that. The story, the narrative John is telling you is what dictates how you handle verses. That's why in episode 1, we went through all of chapter 17. We didn't read every single verse. We went through the narrative of chapter 17 to show why 17:9 can't prove Calvinism. Then in episode 2, in John chapter 10, we went from 26, 25 is where we started, verse 25 to verse 38. That conversation to show that you can't use 26, 27, 20 to prove Calvinism. It doesn't work. It doesn't matter what you read. What you're reading has to make sense in the story, in the narrative. And Calvinism doesn't. So anyway, I got to stop. It's 29 minutes. So we'll do that. We'll cover Paul's conversion, and then Judas, and then Jesus weeping over Jerusalem. When that one's crazy. That one's super powerful to show that he didn't give them a general call like Calvinists say, like, oh, everyone's supposed to come to me. Like there's a command to come to me, and there's a command to believe. No. He says specifically, I'm coming for your salvation. And then they don't get saved. So anyway, we got to stop. But I hope that helps anyway. If you guys have questions, let me know. See ya.